You're listening to Mechanic.com.au podcast, Australia's #1 podcast for automotive service and repair professionals. This week's podcast is proudly brought to you by Disc Brakes Australia, stopping the world. I'm your host, Jason Owen. Today we're joined by Philip Joseph, who is the General Manager of Operations at Disc Brake Australia. Welcome to the show, Philip. How are you going today, mate?
Thanks, Jason. It's great to be with you guys and to the whole listener base.
Absolutely. And I understand you're coming from sunny Sydney today. Is that right?
Yeah, we're not in lockdown, thankfully. Out about and making the most of it.
Putting the sunscreen on as you do down there at Bondi. Is that right?
Exactly. We're a little bit west of that, but we'll try and do our best.
Well, today we're going to talk about the past, present and future of brake rotors. And I think it's going to be a really exciting story. I'm looking forward to it. Let's kick it into overdrive. Now, why was there a need for brake rotors in the very, very start of things, mate?
Yeah, so I guess as a lot of listeners will know, disc brakes were sort of a second iteration. Obviously, drum brakes came first.
The mighty drum brakes.
Yeah, and you know, it's still around to this day, but probably from around the 1950s, 1960s, it started to sort of be introduced. You know, a lot of repetitive braking, increased vehicle weight, and performance requirements sort of really needed a disc brake or something that could handle the repetitive stops where the drum brakes sort of fall down.
Okay, and obviously, you know, servicing of brake components has obviously changed a lot in that time as well.
Yeah, so probably at the start, there wasn't a real view to replace brake rotors. Initially, everyone would just machine them, and it was probably much unheard of that you'd actually go and replace one.
Okay. And obviously, you know, with brake run-out bits and pieces and so forth and different materials and makeups, that's changed a lot now. But how did DBA first get involved with brake rotors?
Yeah, so it's quite a long back history with the Joseph family.
I've been really looking forward to this, mate. So throw us in because the history is so interesting.
Yeah, I guess it's probably a good milestone to do it now, which I'll come to. But the company started with my grandfather, really.
Your grandfather?
So he was a mechanic, and then sort of father was a mechanic. I didn't get the mechanic genes, but I got the automotive genes, so doing my best.
Is it overalls? Is it jeans, or is it set overalls when you get it passed down like that?
Look, I'm keeping the blue shirt going and steel caps occasionally, but no, there's no overalls these days.
So you're third generation, is that right?
I am, and there's a fourth generation, but I don't know if he's going to take over as well. We'll have to go and see. Okay,
so it all kicked off with your grandfather, is that right?
Yeah, so he was working at a mechanic workshop called Sydney Clutch and Brake Exchange at Waterloo, which is quite a bit of history in Sydney and is quite well known. And so over the years, father had been working there. He finished his HSC, I think it was in 1973 on the Friday, and as legend goes, on the Monday, grandfather said, you know, you're coming to work and roll up your sleeves these days.
Wow. And so where to from there?
So primarily they really did a lot of cylinder heads, clutches, brakes, bonded shoes and master cylinders.
Okay.
And that was their sort of bread and butter work. And then sort of Philip Senior, so we've got the same name, which makes it a bit confusing.
Yes.
Went off, bought another business, was working in the automotive space. And then sort of he came back to Sydney Clutch and Brake to run their Fenton's automotive, the re-sleeving division.
Okay.
They were at Bondi Junction, moved to Waterloo. And sort of he was working a few functions there. And then one day he was working behind the counter and a gentleman came in and wanted to buy a brake rotor for a 1967 HDHR Holden.
Yes.
He couldn't buy a genuine one. There was no stock. No one sort of made ones. But the manager at the time said, Oscar Joseph, my grandfather, can help you out. So they sort of tasked him with making a brake rotor. So he had a gentleman called Keith Chichi at the time who helped him make the original patents. They made 20 raw castings.
Wow.
They machined them down to 8 good ones, and they sold one. So
wow.
It was a slow start, but from 20 to 1.
So there was like a stock shortage for the Holden, and that's how the first rotors came about.
Yeah, so he couldn't source one. I'm not sure exactly what was happening, but there wasn't a huge market outside of genuine product, but just couldn't get his hands on one. So it was pretty much by faith. He rocked up to that workshop and asked for it.
Well, like all good stories like this, and we all have them, in each state. Did word get around? I'm thinking that there's a bit more to this story. What happened after that?
Yeah, so obviously he sold one out of the first batch, and then it was probably 6 months later, another gentleman came through for a 1968 XP Ford Falcon, and the same sort of thing. Have you got one? And obviously disc brake rotors, it's very dimensional based.
Yes.
So the original batch didn't fit, but he said, we've done it, we can do it, and again sort of made his first batch and sold one rotor. So they weren't replacing two at the time, they just did the one disc they needed. So
that's unheard of. When you think about it today, though, Philip, can you imagine trying to replace one brake rotor? You couldn't do it legally. It's not the right thing to do.
Yeah, they just machine until basically the car was gone. Whereas these days you've only got 1 or 2 mils, and then obviously the regulations kick in, and you've got to replace them for safety.
Wow. Okay, and so what happened after? So he's done one for the HR, he's done one for the XP. Then what happened?
Yeah, so Phil thought, there could be a bit of a business here. There's obviously sporadic use for it. So he sort of started to go door knocking or work around other workshops and say, have you got a demand for replacement brake rotors? And, they used to literally laugh at him and say, no one replaces rotors. It's just not something you do. So, he slowly started to do this, and every now and then someone would come in and he sort of started making them for the MG, the Ford Cortina. They're still laughing, but, it went from sort of one-offs to selling 3 a month and then 30 a month.
Wow.
We're probably sort of 1,000 times that these days, luckily.
Far out. And from that, did he sort of start his inventory?
Yeah, so we started to build it out. Everyone would be quite familiar with the DBA part numbering system, which is kind of the standard used by a lot of companies in Australia. DBA 100, 105. I guess these days we've got that many part numbers in the thousands. We're sort of jumbling it and trying to find some slots and reorganize it as we go.
And obviously, in those early days, there's been some players that are probably, almost in the DBA Hall of Fame from the thanks side of things.
Yeah, Phil Senior's been inducted to the Hall of Fame as well, thankfully, from the AAA. But I think there's a lot of common faces from that era back then that were real pioneers in the industry.
Well, did DBA have any involvement with the initial creation and innovation of the brake rotors?
So they started to come out with the early Jaguars in the 1950s, obviously from England, and the Holdens and Fords had them at that point.
Right.
But probably DBA was probably the first company in Australia to actually start manufacturing aftermarket replacement. So there wasn't really that industry happening at that time.
And the name, obviously, by the sounds of it, it's pretty easy to work out where the name came from.
You'd think so, but it's a bit all over the shop. So it actually predated by, I think it was about 10 years or so or 20 years when they started making the first set. So Oscar Joseph, when he started seeing these Jaguars coming out with disc rotors, he registered the name Disc Brakes in, I think it was 1963, and then sort of iterated from there. So I think when PJ was a motor mechanic, he changed the name to Disc Brakes Australia when someone said, it's an Australian company, you should add the word Australia. Yeah. So it's very literal, Disc Brakes Australia. And a lot of people would say, you should change it or make it a bit more creative. But I think, PJ sort of loved it. It was spot on, and that's sort of what the company was.
Are you sure one of them didn't go down to the fortune teller and say, I can see a future with a machine called Google, and you need to have the name chosen correctly because of the search engine optimization? Because they nailed it, really, didn't they?
Yeah, well, I think these days, everyone goes on Google and they type what they want in the country. So it's probably a bit of a blessing for us, Disc Brakes Australia.
It's a masterstroke from a marketing point of view. So what year and location was DBA established?
Again, I probably guess this is kind of one of the ongoing debates of, when do you say Disc Brakes was truly born? Was it from Oscar registering the name in 1963?
Yep.
the first batch of rotors we made at Sydney Clutch and Brake in probably 1980. So I kind of peg it personally at, when did we first start making disc brake rotors? So it's just over 40 years ago now.
Well, the history sounds very long and rich in the tapestry of the company from that historical side of things. When you start saying numbers like 1963, 1980s, those were the years. Those cars were incredible back then, and it really is truly an Australian story. What was the first version of DBA's brake rotors? What did they look like?
I guess, again, it's dimensional. So when you think of it objectively, it's a round piece of cast iron. But, it was quite crude back then. We didn't have the sort of CNC machines that we're using now. Fail rates of the castings, if you made 20 and only got 8 good ones out of it, you've been for a bit of a shock these days.
Yeah, right.
But all our products are direct replacement, so you just take off the old one and put it straight back on.
Yeah, it would have been very much cutting edge engineering. Like you can just sort of think about the machines whirring in the background and metal being poured in here and there with the outcome and the goal, the eye on the prize. What was the key point of difference from the competitors, though? Yeah,
so I guess first to market, it gives you a lot of scope to sort of define what you stand for. And sort of once it started to take off and started making them, there's a bit of a competition coming in, particularly from overseas. So back in those days, Taiwan and Korea, obviously. Yep. Quite a good car industry in Korea now, and a little bit from China, but nothing to what it is today. But I guess really the big difference was the quality. So as you said, sort of the Australian mindset and skill set, really just focusing on their trade. So I think always just going back to the focus on quality for us, and I'm sure there's the same across a lot of industries. It all comes back to what's the quality offering in the brands.
Yeah. It certainly is. The quality has to be one thing you have to keep an eye on with this type of component. What were the main milestones that evolved brake rotors over the years?
Yes, so from a technology point of view, the manufacturing techniques. These days we use CNC machines for the majority of our work. Back then they had Herbert machines weren't specifically geared to it. In terms of the product technology, there's been a lot of advancements. So the different types of ventilation, from previously solid rotors, now we've got ventilation, metal compositions, heat dams, slotting and cross-drilling. We do two-piece rotors, and then, at the pointy end of the industry, carbon ceramics and all these new technologies they're trying to invent.
Okay. And the introduction of technology and the change in vehicle design, that's something that's constantly evolving as well?
Yeah, we've got funny stories where we can sell a Toyota Hilux rotor, and depending which factory it comes from, they're both sold in Australia, but it's got a different rotor part. So, they're always trying to change it, keep part supply diverse. So it's a constant game of just trying to keep on top of the car park. So we've got over 98% coverage these days, which is a huge effort.
I know you guys have had to adapt to the market as well. What will give us some of the examples of what you've brought to the market through these processes?
Yeah, so DBA is probably quite well known for some of the IP we've come up with. Talking about ventilation, we've got our kangaroo paw ventilation.
I love that. That's so Aussie, isn't it? You put some flannel out and a mullet on it. It's as close to Australian as you can get.
Yeah, just we should have put Skippy on the box and we'd be there.
And what else have you put into the designs now?
Yeah, so the kangaroo paw ventilation. So there's a post and pillar design, and it was kind of the name came after. So it was proving the technology and the R&D, and then branding it. Our slot design. So everyone will be very familiar with our T2 and T3 slot design.
Yes.
So as soon as you walk past a car in the car park, I find myself doing this every day, walking through and just seeing who's got it on. At the post office the other day, it was a Mercedes had it. I'm looking out the window now. I can see a Commodore's got one. It's all over the place. It's great to be able to sort of recognize the product.
Yeah.
We've got end shield coating, so stopping the rust on rotors, two-piece rotors, which you see these days. quite common in a lot of the new European, but what we've done is we've made it a removable two-piece, so you can replace the rings.
Yes.
So it's quite popular, especially in the sort of performance or the racing scene where, it's not a cheap replacement exercise, but they can sort of cut that cost down. And those two-piece, we call them our 5000 series. So they've got the replaceable rings, aluminium anodized hats, National Aerospace Standards nuts and bolts, heat paint, it's quite a lot of things that we've put into it. But, constantly focusing on the R&D side of it.
What do they look like today? What do brake rotors look like today? And what are the main differences since their inception? Because, we talked about the ventilation, but they've come so far, haven't they?
Yeah, it's amazing. You look at it, and we've still got old fitment applications in the warehouse, and on the surface it looks very similar, but going right down to sort of the actual grey cast iron, flake sizes of carbon. There's so much technology that goes into it. So there's a lot happening. Probably not that you can see visually, but we're constantly working on new R&D projects.
And am I right in thinking that the slotting and cross-drilling process wasn't, from a normal traditional vehicle use? It was from a commercial use. Is that right?
Yes, it was actually, we saw it happening in some of the European markets, the cross-drilling, and I think, going back, it wasn't sort of what it is today. And, Philip Senior just went out and they started trying all these cross-drilling styles, and really from an aesthetics point of view, and said, these look sporty and quite good. But he was at one of the trade shows one day, and all these wives of the mechanics started coming up to him and thanking him, and he didn't know what was going on. And then, the women used to go and do the parts run. So the husbands would be the mechanics, and the women would be running around making sure all the inventory was in stock, and they'd be loading up their vehicles. You'd have engine components and rotors and all this heavy product. And the cars just wouldn't stop back then. But with the cross-drilling, I find it was stopping a lot better, and they're coming up and thanking him and saying, "You sort of really bringing out a safety product for us."
Well, look, success at the racetrack and the adulation is fantastic, and I think one of the biggest success stories you have is that you do carry a range for over 98% of registered vehicles on Australian roads, and that car park, the diverse car park that you've got now, it has some incredible numbers attached to it from your company.
Yeah, so it's a constant battle. Every new generation of vehicle, they'll slightly change the part numbers. I think Australia is probably the best breeding ground for a brake rotor company you could have in terms of the diversity of imports from whether it's Holden or Ford. You've got Toyotas. Cars from Korea or America. We're getting the Chinese vehicles in now. Almost every second vehicle is a European vehicle these days. And
there's one thing there as well. Sometimes, and quite often or not, this happens. Your product will exceed, in some cases, what the OEM product is on these vehicles. So it gets better coming to you.
Yeah, so we'll bring out, some of the things that you'd find rust on the rotors. The Ensure product will stop that, performance upgrade. So, we see a lot of cars where they'll buy them brand new and just do a lot of these brake upgrades straight off the bat, particularly for sort of tradie vehicles or mechanics where they put a lot of weight on from day one. It's not so much a replacement for the need of it. It's a performance upgrade.
I've got a couple of quick numbers and we'll move on to the next question. You guys deal with 20 to 30 new application releases every month. You've got 1,600 unique fitments and 5,500 variants. Those numbers are outstanding. They're just mind-blowing.
Yes, it's like I said, it's just constantly growing and just variants. So we can offer you 2 or 3 or 4 different types of products for the same car, and we've got these in 3PLs all around the country. So it's big numbers when you start thinking about it these days. What
sort of testing do you do on them?
Look, we've got testing throughout the whole life cycle of rotors. So from the get-go, the initial R&D, so whether it's getting an OE sample, which we like to do, just to confirm all the dimensional data, CAD modelling, so especially when we're putting on a kangaroo paw or cross-drilling or T3, And, we can do a lot of simulation testing these days, but, it's only so good to check it on a computer. But, because we are a manufacturer, we'll get the cast iron, we'll get batches of them, we'll cut them open, check the profiles, check the flake size, we'll balance them. So we balance all our product.
Yep.
We've just put a brand new piece of machinery in to help with disc thickness variation. So the DTV checker, getting away from the old dial gauges to an electronic system. And then, the real test is getting out there on the road. So from the racetrack, we do a lot of work with that. We used to have a Brute Ute back in the day, which we were racing.
I remember those. They were fantastic.
Yeah, so, that was a great proving ground. But, we do a lot of work. We just had Dave Reynolds not long ago from Penrite Racing. So he was testing our product on a Volkswagen Polo GTI, I think it was, around the racetrack. So really getting
He would have belted the heck out of that thing. He would have belted the heck out of it.
Well, he took me for the first run on the track, and I basically was hugging everything I could on the car, and
Except
he
for
wasn't
him.
even breaking a sweat.
Let's fast forward to 2040. What are brake rotors going to look like, and how do you think it's going to affect the mechanics?
I wish I had that crystal ball we had 40 years ago coming up with the name. But I guess it's really just trying to see, where we see emergence that's happening. So it's quite tricky to see, what's going to happen in 5, 10, even 20 years. I think a lot of mechanics see these numbers in electric vehicles and just say, what's the future of the industry and what's it going to look like? But I guess one thing you got to constantly remind yourself is in Australia, the average car is 10 years old. So in 20 years' time, it's going to be 2030 models. It's going to be the average vehicle. So obviously a lot of newer vehicles, but just trying to see what's happening day by day. So we're constantly looking what's happening out there in the market.
A lot of electrical products and, electric vehicles and, energy regeneration. And I have no doubt, as you probably don't either, brake rotors are a massive source of energy and power in a car.
Yeah, exactly. So, if you look at the Teslas, what they're doing, it's all about recapturing the power that's out there. So you do see lower wear rates on those, but it also depends on the environment. So, we tend to make product before we even have a demand for it, just to be sort of first to market. But, a few years ago, we were selling them as soon as the Tesla started to launch into the Hong Kong market and some of these markets where, quite hilly or more intense driving conditions where they couldn't regenerate quick enough. So it was actually wearing through the rotors. So we were doing performance upgrades for those.
Well, let's skip through these next couple of questions and let's see what we've got here. Do you think our brakes will evolve further? Where do you think to next?
Yeah, so, if you look at the car park, everyone's trying new technology. So, two-piece rotors, they're changing how they work. We're seeing different coatings. So I don't know if you've seen the new Porsche. I think it's on the four-wheel drive. They've put a tungsten carbide
yes, I had
coating
seen
on
it.
it.
But it's not cheap. It's not cheap.
No, so I think I was watching a YouTube video. There's some great material online, but I think it was $11,000 for a replacement set of those.
Wow.
So I thought, it's great, but you only get 30% more life. So, probably at this stage it's a bit more of a gimmick or a headline grabber, but I don't know how many people are too keen to spend $11,000 on rotors.
Do you ever think we'll get to a point where the brake rotors will become non-serviceable?
I guess it's a question really around the access to technology, which we're seeing at the moment. So you'll see a lot of the new European vehicles, what they're doing, they're making electronic logbooks. So it's getting harder and harder for some of the workshops to actually do some of the compliance work. So, resetting fault code. So I know the AAA has been a big proponent of just trying to get access and provide that support to the workshops. Okay. So I guess it's always going to be a serviceable or replaceable item in my mind. But, it's just trying to get the support there and have people able to do it themselves.
Well, when you say do it themselves, obviously there's a big DIY market out there. Do you see that still existing in the future?
Yeah, so, looking back, my grandfather used to say, the only things that wore on a vehicle were sort of the wiper blades, the tyres, probably the batteries and the car light bulbs and clutches and brakes. But I guess we're seeing some of those drop off. Obviously, brakes are one that a lot of the DIY guys can do themselves. But I guess it comes back to, being able to reset those fault codes,
yes.
Maintain the logbook. So I think it will be for quite some time in the future. And that's, a great market. It's a real enthusiast market.
All right. Well, let's wrap this one up by this last question, which is one of my favourites. What are some of the facts mechanics often don't know about DBA?
Yeah, so I guess one of the things that sort of gets overlooked quite a bit is, DBA is really the only major manufacturer of brake rotors in Australia. So over the whole 40 years. So, there's some small bespoke operators, but for the largest provider of brake rotors, I think that's overlooked quite a bit. We're constantly investing in the business. So we've spent about $500,000 on a couple of new pieces of equipment, R&D, manufacturing, and, investing in R&D. But there's a lot of different suppliers out there. A lot of the guys that sort of import, just clip the ticket, that, DBA really does understand and make and know what they're talking about in this space.
Well, I think there's another fact that mechanics and workshop owners will take away from this podcast, and it's one that I learned, and I think you should be very proud of. Your third generation, Philip, in this business. It is an Australian business, and having you there and having you in your position will create a lot of trust through the brand with the people who are listening. So, mate, look, I'd say thanks very much for coming on the show. And if our listeners have any follow-up questions about anything we've discussed today, they can go ahead and reach out to DBA via Mechanic.com.au community. If you're not already a member of Mechanic.com.au, join the thousands of other mechanics around Australia who are earning, learning and networking more at Mechanic.com.au, the home of Australia's mechanics, by creating a free account today. Thanks for tuning into the Mechanic.com.au podcast, Australia's #1 podcast for automotive service and repair professionals. If you want to unlock a whole host of trade-only resources, including our private community, competitions, educational content, job opportunities, training, troubleshooting, and much, much more, go ahead and create a free account now at Mechanic.com.au. We'll catch you on the next episode of the Mechanic.com.au podcast soon.